Historical sources are central to your study of the past and are important to your success in history assessment pieces. Therefore, it is crucial that you understand what historical sources are and the various kinds and types they exist in. So what is a historical source? A source is something that provides you with information about the historical topic you are studying. They can either be written, like books or websites, or non-written, like photographs or artifacts. No matter what you're doing in history, you'll use sources in order to find out information from the past. This could mean simply reading a textbook or a website, or attempting to interpret ancient artifacts. Either way, these documents and artifacts provide information that is useful to your historical studies and are therefore considered sources. There are two kinds of sources, primary and secondary. The main difference between a primary and a secondary source is when they were made. In order to determine whether a particular source is a primary or secondary source, you need to determine its time of creation. If a source was made during the historical period you're studying, it is considered a primary source. If the source was made after the time period you're studying, it is considered a secondary source. So what are primary sources? As stated, primary sources are sources of information that were made during the historical period that you are studying. For example, if you're studying World War I, any document created at the time of the war would be considered a primary source. Alternatively, a primary source is a document that was made by someone who lived through the events they describe, even if they wrote down what they saw several years later. For example, someone could have lived through World War I as a teenager, but only wrote down their experiences decades later. As a result, their writing is still considered a primary source about World War I. Often, primary sources are the most difficult to find, but as a result, are often the strongest evidence you can use in your assessment pieces. There are some common types of primary sources that you will be looking at. The most common are published documents. These are written sources that were intentionally published to be read by other people. Examples of published documents include books, magazines, newspapers, government documents, advertisements, maps, posters, and legal documents. When reading published documents, please remember that just because they are published does not necessarily make them accurate or reliable. Another type of primary source is an unpublished document. Unpublished documents are also mainly written sources, but were not originally intended to be read by a wide audience, and were typically only meant for the personal use of the author. Examples of unpublished personal documents include letters, diaries, and school report cards. Unlike published documents, unpublished records may be difficult to find because few copies exist. Please be aware that in some cases, unpublished documents can be collected and eventually published, but always keep in mind that they were not originally intended for public consumption. A third type of primary source are visual documents. These are sources that are predominantly images and not words. Such examples of visual documents include photographs, films, paintings, cartoons, and posters. Since visual documents contain more images than words, they require careful interpretation to work out what message they are trying to convey. The final type of primary source are artifacts. Artifacts are man-made objects that are usually uncovered by archaeologists. Examples of artifacts are pottery, furniture, clothing, buildings, and other physical items from the past. Like visual documents, because there is no writing on artifacts, they require careful interpretation to be used as evidence in your arguments. Usually you can use artifacts to corroborate or contradict what your written sources say about the past. In contrast to primary sources, secondary sources are documents that were made after the time period you are studying and were created by people who didn't personally experience the events they describe. For example, if you are reading a history textbook about World War I by an author who didn't live through the war, it would be considered a secondary source. Since secondary sources can basically be written by anyone since the time of the events, you'll find that some secondary sources are better than others. Typically, you should only use secondary sources that are written by qualified historians, such as academics, as they are usually more reliable. Like primary sources, secondary sources come in different types. The most common type of secondary sources are books. Books such as school textbooks often have a lot of information about a particular historical period. Another common type of secondary source are academic journal articles. Academic articles are documents that are written by university academics that are published in academic journals for other university academics to read. Since academic journal articles are the result of many years of research by specialists in particular areas of history, They are some of the highest quality secondary sources you can use. However, please be aware that academic journals are written for an academic audience, so the language can be very difficult to read at first. A third kind of secondary source are websites. There are countless numbers of websites that discuss historical events and people. As a result, different websites vary widely in accuracy, reliability, and relevance. However, very few of them are created by qualified historians or experts in their fields. Therefore, be critical of the websites you find through a basic Google search, as most are not of sufficient quality for your essays. If you choose to use websites as secondary sources, make sure you only choose them from respectable individuals or institutions such as universities, museums, or government archives. So now that you know what primary and secondary sources are and what types they exist in, let's look at some examples to solidify your learning. The example sources we'll be looking at will be providing information about the ancient Roman city of Pompeii in Italy, which was buried as a result of an eruption from Mount Vesuvius in AD 79. The first source is by a Roman author called Pliny the Younger, who wrote a letter about the events to his friend Tacitus. In the letter he says that one day, between 2 and 3 in the afternoon, a cloud of unusual size and appearance was rising from Vesuvius. I can best describe its shape by likening it to a pine tree. It rose into the sky on a very long trunk from which spread some branches. Ash was falling, bits of pumice and rocks that were blackened and burned and shattered by the fire. The buildings were being rocked by a series of strong tremors and appeared to have come loose from their foundations and to be sliding this way and that. Now, even though Pliny wrote this letter many years after the events occurred, he was still an eyewitness of the eruption. Therefore, he is considered a primary source of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79. A second example is also a Roman author called Cassius Dio, who wrote a history book about ancient Rome in which he mentioned the eruption. He describes the events as follows. A great fire suddenly flared up at the very end of the summer. Mount Vesuvius had inexhaustible fountains of fire. Then came sudden violent earthquakes. First, huge stones flew up as high as the mountaintop. Then came a great quantity of fire and endless smoke. All the while an inconceivable quantity of ash was being blown out. It buried 2 entire cities, Herculaneum and Pompeii. Now Cassius Dio wasn't born until AD 155, and didn't write his historical account until over 100 years after the events took place. Therefore, he is considered a secondary source of the events he describes. Our third and final source are the archaeological remains of the city of Pompeii itself, an entire Roman city buried in meters of ash and pumice.
Good day everyone, I am Nicole C. Villapando from BS Ed 1E. Today, I will discuss the topic that I choose, which is Introduction to History. But first, we need to identify or to know what is history. When we say history, it means derived from the Greek word historia, which means knowledge acquired through inquiry or investigations. History, also known as the study of the past. History is the account of the past of a person or a group of people through written documents and historical evidence. History also focuses on writing about wars, revolution, and other important breakthroughs. History is existing for about 2,400 years. Traditional historians live for no document, no history. It means that unless a written document can prove a certain historical event, then it cannot be considered as a historical fact. Here are some valid historical documents. First, government records. Second, chronicles account. Third, personal letter. And the last one is receipt. Discrimination in the validity of history. Restricting historical evidence as exclusive written is a discrimination against other social classes who were not recorded in paper. Others got their historical documents burned or destroyed in the events of war or colonization. Question and issues in history. First, what is history? Second, why study history? Third, and history for whom? Historiography is the history of history. It covers how historians have studied and developed history, including its sources, techniques, and theoretical approaches. It should not be confused with history because history is the study of the past, the events that happened in the past. It focuses on how a certain historical text was written, who wrote it, what was the context of its publications, what historical method was employed, what sources were used. Here are some various roles of history in the past. The first one is to unite a nation. The second one is tools to legitimize regimes and force a sense of collective identity through collective memory. The third one is can be used to make a sense of the present. And the last one is being reminded of a great past can inspire people to keep their good practices to move forward. Positivism is the school of thought that emerged between the 18th and 19th century. This thought requires empirical and observable evidence for one can claim that a particular knowledge is true. Historians were required to show written primary documents in order to write a particular historical narrative. Post-colonialism is the school of thought that emerged in the early 20th century when formerly colonized nations grappled with the idea of creating their identities and understanding their societies against the shadows of their colonial past. Two things in writing history. The first one is tell the history of their nations that will highlight their identify free from that colonial discourse and knowledge. The second one is to criticize the methods, effects, and idea of colonialisms. History and the historian. Facts cannot speak for themselves. It is the historian's job not just to seek historical evidence and facts but also to interpret them. Here are some important reasons why do we need to study the past. First, understand other cultures. Second, increase understanding of identities and society. Third, understand the changes. And the last one is we will able to learn from mistakes in the past. The father of the history and the first historian in the historian record is Herodotus. Historian can access information through historical evidence and historical sources. Historical methodology. It comprises certain techniques and rules that historians follow in order to properly utilize sources and historical evidence in writing history. Historical sources. The historian's most important research tools are historical sources. Two classifications of historical sources. The first one is primary sources. It means are those sources produced at the same time as the event, period, or subject being studied. Here are some examples of primary sources. Archival documents, artifacts, memorabilia, letters, census, and government records. The second one is secondary sources. It means are those sources produced by an author who used primary sources to produce the material. Here are some examples of secondary sources. Books, biography, theses, dissertations. Both primary and secondary sources help us using writing and learning. When examining a source, the historian must conduct A. External criticism, the practice of verifying the authenticity of evidence by examining the physical characteristics, consistency with the historical characteristics of the time when it was produced, and the materials used for the evidence. Letter B. Internal criticism is the examinations of the truthfulness and factuality of the evidence. It looks at the content of the source and examines the circumstances of productions. It could be done by looking at the authors, its context, agenda, the purpose behind its creation. Deception cases in Philippines history. Hoax Code of Kalanchaw. The code was a set of rules contained in an epic Margratas which was alleged written by Dato Kalanchaw. In 1968, an American historian, William Henry Scott, debunked the authenticity of the code due to lack of evidence to prove that the code existed in pre-colonial Philippine history. Ferdinand Marcos as World War II soldier. This was widely believed by students of history, and Marcos had war medals to show. This claim was disproven when historians counter-checked Marcos' claims with the war records of the United States. Filipino historian Sue Salazar introduced the new guiding philosophy for writing and teaching history, pantayong pananaw. This perspective highlights the importance of facilitating an internal conversation and discourse among Filipinos about our own history, using the language that is understood by everyone. The more you know about the past, the better prepared you are for the future. By Theodore Roosevelt. Again, I am Nicole C. Villapando from BS Ed 1E. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day.